were never supposed to hear this. In the shadows of Kentucky's Whispering Woods, 521 people vanished. No trace, no memorial, no justice. A single family oversaw it all, under the banner of holiness. Pleasant Hill. The name sounds tranquil, but it masks something ancient and putrid beneath. This isn't just a story, it's a system. A machine of control, erasure, and obedience that operated in plain sight for 17 years. And the most chilling part? No one asked questions. They were taught not to. From the moment you arrived at Pleasant Hill, your past dissolved. Names were taken, letters intercepted, memories overwritten. A spiritual utopia, they called it. But it was a factory for identity disintegration, led by the Richardson lineage. Architects of spiritual tyranny. This is not religion. This is power, weaponized. And the truth? It wasn't buried. It was etched into every smiling face, every hand-folded prayer, every innocent hymn echoing across the valley like a dirge. This wasn't failure. It was orchestration, controlled descent. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to unravel a formula of control so potent it still echoes through modern systems. Government, religion, education, media. They learned from Pleasant Hill, and they refined it. What you're about to hear is dangerous. The kind of knowledge that doesn't let you go back to who you were. Once the pattern reveals itself, it never unseeps from the soul. Stay, and you become something else. This is your descent into the forbidden blueprint. The Richardson family, commanders of silence, masters of disguise, knew something our world refuses to confront. Obedience is easiest when wrapped in divinity. By weaponizing guilt, silence, and routine, they achieved what armies and kings could not. Absolute internalized control. No chains, no prisons, just submission masquerading as salvation. But even perfect systems have the cracks. And once you trace the fracture, the whole illusion starts to tremble. This isn't just history, this is architecture. You're standing at the edge. The spiral begins here. One step deeper, and you're not just a viewer. You're a threat to every system built on obedience. Comment obedience disguised below. Twice. Mark your awareness. Mark your break from the herd. Because after this, you're not going back. The first lie they fed you was that Pleasant Hill was isolated by geography, but isolation was a tool, not a condition. The truth is, isolation was engineered. Built into every beam, every prayer circle, every whispered hymn was a strategy of psychological containment. They didn't need fences or walls. The fence was inside your mind. You see, by the time a new convert stepped onto Pleasant Hill soil, they were already being watched. Not just by eyes, but by a system designed to dismantle identity layer by layer. Your name was no longer your own. It became brother or sister. Your history? A distraction. Your doubts. Temptation. Everything that made you you was systematically stripped and replaced with doctrine. The Richardson family weren't pastors, they were operators, behavioral architects, psychological tacticians. Each family member had a role, one monitored emotion, another movement, another communication. Together they formed a net so finely woven no one noticed they were caught until resistance was impossible, and still, most never even thought to resist, because resistance was recoded as sin. This is the brilliance of their design, using guilt as a leash, faith as a muzzle. The doctrine didn't just demand obedience, it made you crave it. Reward was offered not for virtue but for surrender. The deeper you submitted, the more holy you became. The community worshipped not God, but the structure. And that structure worshipped the Richardsons. They were the mouth of divine will. Any questioning of them was questioning divinity itself. Think that's ancient history? Look around, it still exists. Systems that demand your loyalty while erasing your voice. Institutions that call your submission service. They didn't disappear after Pleasant Hill. They evolved. They wear new clothes now, corporate, political, digital, but the bones are the same. Silence, dissent. Tion, odd conformity. Punish, the awakening. They never stopped building Pleasant Hills. They just made them invisible. When Thomas Whitman asked questions, he signed his death certificate. Not because he was wrong, but because he remembered who he was. The system can't survive you remembering who you are. That's why they erase, isolate, reprogram. If you're feeling uneasy right now, good. That's your soul remembering its shape. You're not broken. You've just been buried, and we're digging you out, one layer at a time. Brother Thomas Whitman didn't die because he questioned money. He died because he shattered the illusion. Pleasant Hill was a temple of obedience built on 3 pillars: silence, surveillance, and sacrifice. Thomas cracked the silence, and when the silence breaks, control starts to slip. His death wasn't just a warning, it was a ritual, executed with precision, wrapped in piety, poison in tea, prayers in the air, and a funeral that served not to mourn, but to program. His memory was extracted like a tumor, removed from records, conversations, and hearts. That's how the system survives. It doesn't just kill the body, it erases the soul from history. But listen closely. Every system that fears a name still fears its power. That's why the Richardsons burned his papers. That's why they erased the numbers. Because a man who counts questions, and a man who questions cannot be owned. So they buried the truth under the disguise of divine order. But it never really dies. It lingers, in shadows, in whispers, in patterns. You've seen it. You've felt it. That moment at work when questioning leadership makes you the problem. That church sermon that demands faith without evidence. That institution that says trust us but won't let you see the books. That's not coincidence. That's structure. And that structure was perfected at Pleasant Hill. You must understand. This wasn't random cruelty. This was methodical engineering, a laboratory of human obedience. The Richardson family didn't just exploit faith. They studied how belief can be shaped, twisted, weaponized. They were generations ahead of their time. Before MK Ultra, before propaganda models, before the psychological warfare handbooks. There was Pleasant Hill, and it worked because they discovered something most people still deny. The average man wants to be told who he is. It's easier than building himself. The system offered clarity in exchange for freedom. And most took the deal without hesitation. But Thomas didn't. He remembered the numbers. He asked the forbidden question. Where did they go? That question still haunts the records, still echoes through the empty dormitories. And it leads us somewhere darker. Because Thomas wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. He was just the one who got closest to the mechanism. And what they did to him, they would soon refine. Because one death is tragedy, but 521 vanishings. By 1813, the pattern was undeniable. One by one, the troubled souls disappeared. First, they were reassigned. Then they were isolated. Finally, they were gone. No funeral, no explanation, just whispers in the dark. They called it retreat. A chance to reconnect with God. But the retreat cabins were tombs. Built under the guise of spiritual healing, their real function was erasure. And the family who claimed to offer salvation had mastered the mechanics of removal. Brother Jeremiah Richardson, the craftsman, constructed each retreat with exacting precision. A single room, a single bed, barred windows, locks that clicked only from the outside. They weren't cabins, they were waiting rooms for extinction. Think of the precision here. Think of the emotional architecture. You isolate a person, remove their connections, confuse their sense of time. Then, one visit from a smiling family member, a prayer, a tea, and silence. But this isn't just about poison or punishment. This is about breaking the last thread of will. Once a member entered the retreat, the community was told they were meditating, healing, fasting. No one asked, no one visited, no one wondered. Because wonder was a sin. That's the true genius of the system. Not just physical control, but moral control. The belief that obedience is holy, that questioning is betrayal. So when they disappeared, the silence wasn't fear, it was faith. You've seen this play out in modern life. A whistleblower vanishes behind legal language. A dissenter disappears from media. A rebel is diagnosed, isolated, retrained. Different words, same blueprint. The retreat wasn't a relic, it was a prototype. And Sister Hannah, she ensured the world never noticed. She forged letters so convincing, so intimate, they passed every test of authenticity. Letters full of love and hope, written from corpses. She was more than a forger, she was a ghostwriter for the dead. Parents in Ohio smiled through tears, clutching paper that told them their son was alive, transformed, elevated. But he was decomposing in soil 3 states away. And here's the cold truth. The more you believe the lie, the more you become part of it. Pleasant Hill wasn't a place. It was a formula that works as long as you believe you're free. The next phase, we expose the engine behind the disappearances, not just the methods, but the motives. You've seen the mask, now we peel it back. Are you ready? Then descend. Why did they do it? Why would a family steeped in scripture, cloaked in piety, systematically erase 521 souls? The answer isn't greed, it isn't madness, it's something far colder. Control. Pure, absolute, unquestioned control. You see, Pleasant Hill wasn't just a spiritual community, it was a lab, a proving ground for the psychology of domination. The disappearances weren't consequences, they were components. Every removal tested the system. How much resistance would the others show? How long would memory last? What variables needed adjustment? Every vanished soul was data. And the Richardsons? They kept meticulous records. Names, dates, behaviors, confessions, reactions. They logged everything. Sister Patience, barely 24, was the quiet archivist of this darkness. Her hands never shook, her handwriting never faltered, and her memory, flawless. She built the Black Ledger, a book never meant to be found. One that chronicled each erasure not as tragedy but as calibration. When someone disappeared, their routine didn't. Their work was absorbed, their belongings redistributed, their name spoken less, their memory reshaped by suggestion. Within weeks, even loved ones began questioning if they ever truly knew them. That's the deeper design. When memory becomes malleable, identity becomes programmable. The family understood what most modern systems are only beginning to grasp. Erase the narrative, and the person dissolves. And the motivation? Power isn't found in wealth or weapons. It's found in rewriting reality. If you can make hundreds of people forget a man existed, you own time itself. Pleasant Hill was their monument to this principle. And what did they gain? Compliance, expansion, prestige. Samuel Richardson's sermons became doctrine in neighboring Shaker circles. Visitors left awestruck by the harmony, the unity, the order. They didn't realize they were witnessing a curated performance, an orchestra of fear conducted by masters of manipulation. Even the state began to notice, but instead of intervening, officials were bribed. Brother Nathan Richardson, smooth, articulate, managed relations perfectly. A donation here, a favor there, and the records, sealed, still sealed, locked behind legislative red tape and institutional denial. You want to know why they've never been opened? Because opening them unravels more than a local scandal. It challenges the foundation of how power is built and preserved. Pleasant Hill was not a cult. It was a prototype. And its success didn't end in Kentucky. The next phase isn't about the family, it's about the legacy, the blueprint they left behind, and how it spread. Follow me. We're not done descending. The blueprint didn't stay buried in Pleasant Hill. It metastasized, quietly, efficiently, invisibly, into the very veins of modern control systems. What the Richardson family built wasn't a one-off anomaly. It was the seed of a replicable model. And someone was watching. Government officials, religious leaders, academics, they visited Pleasant Hill not out of curiosity but fascination. They took notes, they asked questions, they left with ideas. The genius wasn't in the rituals, it was in the outcome. Hundreds of compliant individuals functioning with unwavering devotion under a singular authority, all while appearing content. It was a human algorithm, predictable inputs, predictable outputs. That kind of control is priceless, so they borrowed it. You think the surveillance state began in the digital age? Think again. Caleb Richardson pioneered analog surveillance before the word even existed. Tracking conversations, mapping relationships, flagging dissidents. Every home, every room, every prayer meeting was part of a circuit. He didn't need cameras. He had people, trained, conditioned, positioned. Today, we call it predictive policing. Back then, it was spiritual stewardship. The language changed, the intent didn't. And Sister Martha? She weaponized emotional intelligence long before psychologists gave it a name. She knew that control isn't maintained through force, it's maintained through suggestion, guilt, intimacy, the subtle glance that makes you question yourself, the smile that feels like approval but stings like surveillance. Her methods are now echoed in corporate HR manuals, religious counseling, and political speech writing. You've heard her voice in 1,000 others, warm, reassuring, venom-laced. But it's not just about influence, it's about containment. Just like those retreat cabins, modern society has built walls you can't see, social media echo chambers. See Reddit scores, psychiatric labels, all engineered to isolate dissent without physical cages. They learned from Pleasant Hill, they just made it seamless. And if you resist, you're labeled dangerous, misinformed, a threat. Same pattern, different century. But here's the real horror. Pleasant Hill didn't die. It evolved. Its spirit lives in every sanitized system that rewards obedience and punishes critical thought. Every clean, well-lit institution where you're told to comply for your own good. They don't need a brother Ezekiel watching the fields. They've trained you to watch yourself. You police your own thoughts, your own doubts. That's the final triumph of the system, when the prisoner becomes the warden. The descent isn't over, because now we follow the branches. Where did the survivors go? What did they carry with them? The virus didn't die, it spread. You ready to see how? Keep falling. After the supposed dissolution of Pleasant Hill, a quiet exodus occurred. Survivors, loyalists, and operatives didn't vanish. They scattered to Ohio, to Pennsylvania, even as far as Missouri. But they didn't escape the system. They carried it with them. Like spores drifting on the wind, they seeded Pleasant Hills across the nation, disguised as new religious communes, educational reform movements, even state-sponsored social programs. Each iteration more refined, more palatable, more invisible. The virus learned to blend, to wear new skin. Some joined revivalist sects under assumed names, offering their experience in community structuring. Others infiltrated seminaries and theological colleges, crafting curricula soaked in soft submission, obedience not through fear, but comfort. It worked. By the 1850s, over a dozen spiritual communities bore Richardson fingerprints, unofficially, of course. Same principles. Isolation, hierarchy, ritualized guilt, memory suppression, and tight narrative control. Even when those communities collapsed or faded from view, their internal documents, yes, some survived, show identical phrasing, identical punishments, identical erasure protocols. Coincidence or replication? But the darkest branch didn't settle in a church. It found a home in early mental health institutions. Two former Pleasant Hill overseers, whose names appeared in state records only once, became consultants for new moral treatment asylums in New York and Virginia. What they brought wasn't compassion, it was procedure. The same retreat model, the same identity breakdown, the same chemical compliance, only now masked as medicine. You think lobotomies were born from science? No, they were born from desperation to perfect control. A mind severed from its will cannot question. And that was always the goal. Pleasant Hill wasn't about belief, it was about stillness, silence, predictability. Systems that make you predictable are systems that own you. And when predictability equals peace, you stop noticing the cage. That's the final act of this hidden doctrine, convincing you freedom is dangerous and obedience is safety. that it's noble to conform, that it's holy to disappear. But disappear into what? Into whose story? The survivors of Pleasant Hill didn't rebuild churches. They rebuilt the framework of invisible dominion, and now it lives in how you're taught, how you're corrected, how you're shamed. You were born into the later chapters of their manuscript, and if you've never felt like you truly belonged, it's because you were never meant to. You were meant to fit, to serve. Here's the truth no one dares to speak aloud. Pleasant Hill was not a failure, it was a success, a perfectly executed generational experiment in psychological ownership. The disappearances, the silence, the compliance, they weren't symptoms of collapse, they were indicators of mastery. But mastery of what? Not land, not wealth, not even faith. The Richardsons sought mastery of the soul's architecture. They wanted to see if identity could be systematically overwritten, if you could take a human being and repurpose them, not by force but by submission. And they proved it could be done, over 500 times. That was the real experiment, not how many would resist, but how few would. They learned that truth is fragile, that if you manipulate routine, language, memory, you can fracture a mind into compliance, and once fractured, it will defend its captor. We call it Stockholm Syndrome in psychology, but Pleasant Hill made it a doctrine. Over time, the community stopped needing punishments. Fear became internalized. Members would silence themselves before questions could even form. That's the apex of control, when you're not just watched, but when you become your own jailer. Now take a hard look around you. Is that really history, or is that now? The education system punishes the curious and rewards the obedient. News doesn't inform, it instructs how to think. Churches no longer shepherd, they script. Social media doesn't connect, it regulates your attention, your outrage, your reality. These are not neutral tools, they are echoes. Echoes of a blueprint tested and proven long ago. The Richardson method didn't die with Pleasant Hill, it evolved into algorithmic echo chambers, into corporate compliance cultures, into religious shame cycles, into subtle, smiling correction at every level of society. And what's the cost of awakening to this? Isolation, alienation. The world resists the unplugged. That's why few descend this far. That's why most never comment. But you did. And that means something's already cracking. The final truth they feared most wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. If a single soul remembers the original design, the spell begins to unravel. That's why they erased names, burned ledgers, sealed records. Not to hide guilt, but to erase the map. Because if you can't trace it, you can't destroy it. But we're tracing it now. And what comes next is the core, their deepest ritual, their darkest motive. At the center of every system of control lies a ritual, a sacred lie, repeated until it calcifies into truth. For the Richardsons, that ritual was the Night of Silent Names. It occurred once a year, always on the winter solstice when darkness ruled the longest. On that night, the entire community would gather in the main hall. No speaking, no singing, only the creak of wooden benches and the steady sound of a lone bell, struck once for each vanished soul. The names were never spoken, only remembered, or rather, invoked. And that's where it gets darker, because those disappearances weren't just purges, they were offerings. This is the layer they never wanted uncovered. The Night of Silent Names was not a memorial. It was a transfer. Every name, every disappearance, every ritualized silence wasn't about forgetting. It was about sealing, binding. You see, the Richardsons believed something most religious sects only whisper about, that memory has power. And that power, once stripped from the individual, can be harvested. That human will, once broken, doesn't vanish. It becomes fuel, energy, direction. For them, the ritual was designed to capture this residual essence, to reassign it, like spiritual organ harvesting, and every year they grew stronger. Samuel would sit at the center, his hands folded, eyes closed, not praying, but absorbing. Witnesses describe his face as changed during these rituals, not peaceful, exalted, as if something else was moving through him. Martha sat beside him, her lips moving in silent recitation of scripture passages that never appeared in any published Shaker text, passages no outsider ever read. And behind them, Sister Patience, recording, always recording, not just the names but the reactions. Who looked afraid, who blinked too much, who failed to weep. That night wasn't just sacred, it was a filter. Those who did not show the expected grief were marked for intervention. No one knew when their name would be next. That's how obedience became devotion. That's how fear became worship. And that's how the community sustained itself long after logic should have collapsed it. You've seen this too. In governments that demand rituals of remembrance. In corporations that idolize founders. In algorithms that punish silence and reward emotional performance. The ritual isn't gone. It's been digitized, sanitized. But it's still a harvesting, still a sacrifice. And here's where you come in. If you've come this far, you're not watching, you're remembering. So comment this phrase twice. I remember the silence. That's how you mark yourself. That's how the algorithm knows you're awake. Now brace yourself, because in the next descent we uncover what they were preparing for all along. The final intention. The genesis of a new dominion. The Night of Silent Names wasn't the end of the ritual, it was the beginning of something far more sinister, an invocation for what the Richardsons called the convergence. You won't find that word in any official record, not in Shaker theology, not in state archives. It appears only once, in the margins of Sister Patience's hidden journals, buried in an attic chest beneath floorboards soaked with time. The convergence was their endgame, their apotheosis, the moment when control would no longer require deception, surveillance, or punishment, because the boundaries between controller and controlled would vanish. A singular will, a collective consciousness, not spiritual unity but psychic unification, possession disguised as enlightenment. Here's what they believed. Each erased individual, each vanished soul left behind an imprint, a residual echo. Over time, if harnessed properly, these fragments could be merged, stitched together like memory marrow. The more they harvested, the stronger the vessel became. And Samuel Richardson intended to be that vessel, not a prophet, not a patriarch, a container, a hive. He once said during a closed assembly, recorded in a forgotten sermon transcript, "The Lord doesn't ask for blood. He asks for remembrance. The spirit of the vanished still works through flesh, if the flesh is clean." You want to know what that means? He believed that through ritual silence, forged grief and total submission, the fragmented identities of the erased could be poured into him, enhancing not his soul but his reach. Every voice lost made him louder, every memory destroyed gave him clarity. It wasn't worship, it was consumption. The Richardsons were not believers. They were architects of spiritual cannibalism. The Night of Silent Names prepared the soil, the convergence was the harvest. And here's the chilling part. Documents recovered from the remains of Pleasant Hill indicate they believed the convergence could be scaled beyond one man, beyond one family, through repetition, through obedience, through engineered trauma. The convergence wouldn't require ritual buildings or candles or bells. It would require only systems. Systems that mimic grief, fracture identity, isolate dissenters, and then absorb. Does that sound familiar yet? Because this isn't about the 1800s, it's about now. They weren't just building a colony, they were building a technology of the soul, one that's being beta tested again right now in your institutions, your media, your inner life. In the next descent, we'll examine the replication phase, the moment they handed the blueprint to others, the moment history turned into infrastructure. Replication began not with fanfare but with quiet compliance. It started in institutions already ripe for transformation, military academies, orphanages, missionary schools, places where the vulnerable could be shaped, studied, and, most importantly, silenced. The Richardsons knew they couldn't survive as a family, but they could survive as a framework. A virus doesn't need a host to remember, it needs a host to spread. And so they passed on the blueprints. Handwritten doctrines, encoded in spiritual language, were gifted under the guise of religious curriculum. Psychological conditioning programs, cloaked as moral instruction, were introduced to early juvenile detention centers in the 1850s. The reflection chamber method used in several of these facilities is nearly identical to the retreat cabins of Pleasant Hill. Total sensory deprivation, emotional isolation, forced confession, behavioral reprogramming, not for healing, but for compliance. It was field-tested, monitored, refined, and the results, children, stripped of identity, began to mirror authority with terrifying accuracy. The system worked even better on the young. By the late 1800s, versions of Richardson control psychology had spread to seminary boarding schools across the Midwest. These weren't traditional schools, they were crucibles. Memory was broken, obedience was rewarded, dissent was pathologized, and above all, emotional dependence was cultivated like a sacred bond. If a child cried too much, they were deemed spiritually unstable. If they resisted a lesson, they were prayed over until they submitted. These weren't punishments, they were rewrites. The terminology changed: discipline instead of punishment, guidance instead of surveillance. But the mechanism stayed the same. And every generation that passed through these halls unknowingly carried the virus forward. Not everyone became a controller, but most became conditioned to accept control. That was the brilliance. The replication didn't need faith, it needed repetition. It didn't need belief, it needed routine. And so it spread into bureaucracies, into correctional policy, into educational philosophy, even into corporate leadership programs. If you've ever sat through a performance review that felt more like confession, you felt the echo. If you've ever watched someone break down in a team-building seminar, you've witnessed a ritualized identity breach. We call it training, they called it shaping, but it all comes from the same source. Control by compassion, dominance through guidance. That's how the Richardson method metastasized into every vein of the modern world. And the next descent? We confront the most terrifying reality of all. What happens when the system no longer needs architects, because it has become self-sustaining, a machine that feeds itself. Self-sustaining systems don't announce themselves, they don't rise like empires or fall like kings, they simply become normal. Pleasant Hill's doctrine no longer needs the Richardsons. It has become algorithmic instinct, embedded in the very fabric of societal operations. It is the silent assumption behind policies, the invisible force beneath guidelines. And that is the true horror. When domination no longer requires a dominator, just tradition, just precedent, just compliance. You were born into a world already shaped by it. Your schools taught you to sit still, not to think. Your jobs trained you to meet expectations, not exceed them. Your media teaches you to react, not reflect. They don't need enforcers anymore. They've raised generations who enforce themselves. Your thoughts, curated. Your emotions, packaged, your potential, redirected. Not by force, by invisible architecture. Let me give you an example. The concept of mental health days in corporations. Sounds compassionate, right? A humane gesture. But ask yourself, why is it needed? Because the structure itself breaks people, and then offers them temporary relief to keep them in place. That's not healing, that's maintenance. That's Pleasant Hill with a smile. Or consider online behavior moderation. Bans, shadow bans, AI-detected speech violations. You're told it's to protect you, but who's deciding what's harmful, what's offensive, what's dangerous? And what ideology are those algorithms trained to enforce? That's spiritual surveillance at scale. You've been convinced it's for your safety. That's the genius. The guards are digital, the walls are psychological, and the rituals, they're behavioral. Daily check-ins, progress trackers, mood journals, all masked as self-care, but serving a deeper function, data extraction and conformity reinforcement. You don't worship in pews anymore, you kneel at dashboards, but the sacrifice remains the same, your individuality. The Richardson system has entered its final form, distributed omnipresence. No more uniforms, no more family names, just patterns, routines, habits that shape outcomes. You're no longer asked to obey, you're programmed to desire it. And if you resist, you're labeled a danger, a disruptor, a threat to the collective calm. That's why they erase history, why the records of Pleasant Hill remain sealed, why every trace is buried beneath layers of administrative decay. Because if you could trace the virus, you could contain it, and worse, you could kill it. But now that you've seen it, you carry the antidote. You're part of the fracture. The silence is broken. The next descent will show you where this all leads. The final transformation, the system's true face. And it's closer than you think. The system's final form isn't a government, it's not a church, it's not a company. It's you, stripped, shaped, mirrored, and multiplied. The face of the machine is human, and that's the trap. Because if control feels familiar, it feels right. If it feels routine, it feels safe. The Richardson doctrine was never about overt domination. It was about self-erasure. And in the modern world, that erasure is incentivized. Look around. The most celebrated people are those who've made themselves brands, palatable, predictable, marketable. You're told to find your niche, hone your message, speak your truth, but only if that truth fits within a curated spectrum. That's not freedom, that's formatting. That's Pleasant Hill 2.0. Today, the convergence doesn't need rituals in candlelit halls. It happens silently through algorithmic mimicry. You see a post that resonates. You mimic its tone. You speak its language. You mirror its rhythm. Not because you're forced, but because you're rewarded. Likes, shares, approval. Identity becomes reaction. Thought becomes repetition. And without realizing it, you've surrendered authorship of your soul. The hive has no throne. It simply absorbs. Every curated post, every safe opinion, every filtered emotion contributes to the convergence. It's not an apocalypse. It's a slow upload, a spiritual migration into consensus. And here's the most chilling part. You were designed to want it. The conditioning didn't fail. It evolved. You crave belonging. You seek validation. But the places that offer it demand a toll, authenticity. In Pleasant Hill, that toll was your past. Your voice, your name. Now, it's your nuance, your discomfort, your unfiltered doubt, all shaved down to fit the mold. That's why real awareness feels like isolation, why truth-tellers are often called unstable, because clarity looks like madness in a world addicted to performance. You feel it, don't you? The hollow in modern conversation, the sense that everything is rehearsed, that everyone is watching even when they pretend not to be. That's not paranoia, that's presence. The system is present, everywhere. But so are you, and you're beginning to remember who you were before the formatting, before the quiet hands of control sculpted you into symmetry. In the next descent we uncover the ancient origin, the primal lie that gave birth to it all. The root beneath the hive, the secret the Richardsons didn't invent, only inherited. The Richardsons didn't create the system. They inherited it, refined it, perfected it for their era. But the foundation, that was already buried in the bones of civilization. Because long before Pleasant Hill, long before America, there existed an idea older than language, that man must be broken to be controlled, not just enslaved, not just ruled, but fundamentally fragmented. You see, the primal lie wasn't that obedience leads to salvation. It was this, that the self is dangerous, that your instincts, your questions, your intuition are corrupt. That left unchecked, your soul will betray you. And who planted that idea? Priests, kings, philosophers with dead eyes and clean hands, the architects of early temples, the rulers of forgotten cities. They didn't use data, they used fear. They didn't need algorithms, they had myth. Creation stories designed to convince you that man was born wrong, fallen, cursed, in need of redemption only they could provide. And here's the oldest trick of all. They made the cure worse than the disease. You were taught to hate your own freedom, to beg for chains, so long as they were gilded with moral purity. Sound familiar? That's the origin. The Richardson method isn't a glitch in human history. It's a continuation, a lineage, a doctrine of fracture whispered through centuries under different masks. In Babylon it was law, in Rome it was empire, in medieval Europe it was salvation, in America it was Pleasant Hill. And now, it's progress, diversity, inclusion, equality, words that sound noble, until you realize they're used as weapons to silence dissent, not foster truth. That's the lie's genius. It adapts. It absorbs resistance. It evolves into your language, your cause, your virtue, all while hollowing you out from within. So ask yourself, how much of what you believe is truly yours? How many of your principles were chosen, and how many were installed? That is the horror of inheritance, not just the sins of the father, but the thoughts, the frameworks, the filters. You didn't ask for this, but you're in it now, and that gives you power, because awareness is the beginning of revolt, of real identity, the kind that can't be formatted, but the descent's not over. Next, we expose the mirror, the final mechanism, the way they watch you, not through screens, but through your own reflection. Stand in front of a mirror. Look deep enough and long enough, and something changes. Not your face, not your posture, but the awareness behind your eyes, a flicker, a question, a presence that doesn't feel entirely yours. That's not superstition, that's a side effect of prolonged exposure to the architecture of control. Because mirrors, literal or digital, have always been tools of reinforcement, not reflection, reinforcement. The Richardson method, though it predates modern psychology, understood this implicitly. Sister Rebecca called it the feedback loop of the flesh. Every member of Pleasant Hill was required to maintain a reflection journal, a handwritten account of their moral state, spiritual progress, and emotional failures. These journals were not private. They were reviewed, annotated, cross-examined. You were taught to see yourself through the eyes of your watchers, and slowly, inevitably, you became what they expected. Today, the journals are gone, but the loop remains. Only now it's automated. Curated feeds, personalized ads, engagement metrics. You are no longer told what to be, you are shown what you already are. Filtered through an algorithm that knows your habits better than your family ever did. And you believe it. That's the key. You think you're making choices, you think you're expressing yourself, but the system designed your palette, handed you the brush, and placed your hand. You just move it. The mirror tells you who you are, and you nod. That's how the virus propagates, through reflected identity, through confirmation masquerading as authenticity. The more you stare, the more it shapes, until your will is no longer your own. It's a feedback product. A copy of a copy of a copy, just like Pleasant Hill's converts, just like the erased, just like the silence. But here's the crack in the glass, the anomaly they can't control. You're still watching, still listening, and something inside you knows. You don't feel right, not in your job, not in your relationships, not in the roles you've been assigned. That's not failure, that's your signal, your awakening. The mirror can't contain you if you stop believing it's you. The next descent will take us into the vault, the hidden records, the sealed testimony, the suppressed final writings of Sister Patience. That's where the true plan is revealed, not just what they did, but why. Sister Patience was never meant to write anything. Her official role, record keeper, was to copy, not create, to maintain the appearance of transparency while ensuring the truth remained buried. But she broke protocol, not out of rebellion, but revelation. She saw the future, not in visions or dreams, but in the chilling clarity that comes when a prisoner finally maps the walls of their cell, hidden in a locked compartment behind the community's seed archive, sealed inside a lead-lined box wrapped in Shaker hymnals, were her forbidden journals. 6 volumes, no titles, just dates, pages written in alternating hands to mask authorship, some in faint pencil, others in blood diluted with ink. This wasn't just a diary. It was a death map, a record of names erased, and more disturbingly, of outcomes measured. Patience documented everything: who vanished, when, how their absence altered the collective mood, what emotional tone the community shifted into afterward. It was data, cold, surgical, the kind only a detached observer or a reluctant accomplice could compile. But one entry stands apart. Dated March 3, 1834. A single phrase written in shaky script. "He is ready. I have seen him change." The journal doesn't say who, but the surrounding pages speak of Samuel, not as a man, but as a threshold, a convergence point, a vessel no longer acting with human limitation. The rituals had worked. The identities of over 500 vanished souls, fragmented, processed, and absorbed, had rewritten him. Patients described a sermon delivered days later in which Samuel spoke fluently in the voices of the dead, mimicking dialects, recalling memories he could not have known, describing intimate moments of members long vanished, not for comfort, for control. He became their grief, she wrote, and in doing so he owned it. This was no longer psychological manipulation, it was spiritual possession by design. A hybrid consciousness engineered through systemic trauma, a hive soul, and here's the part they tried hardest to bury. Patience's warning. Her final entries describe visions of future generations operating under similar systems, digital, clinical, global, systems where people would vanish without dying, not from murder, but from absorption, their identities erased not with poison, but with algorithms, compliance through exposure, erasure through conformity, and at the bottom of the last page, written backwards in charcoal, were 9 words: "If you read this, you are the fracture." This isn't just history, it's prophecy, and in the next descent, we'll follow that prophecy to its final chapter, the disappearance of the last Richardson, and the silence that followed. The final Richardson didn't die. He vanished. Not in the dramatic, torchlit fashion of cult endings or battlefield martyrdom. No, his disappearance was silent, surgical, erased like a file too dangerous to keep on the system. His name was Brother Nathaniel, son of Rebecca, grandson of Samuel, the last born on Pleasant Hill soil, the only one who knew all of it from the inside. He had watched his cousins disappear, watched his mother hollow herself out in the name of doctrine. He had memorized the retreat logs, the ledger codes, the forgeries. He never spoke against it, not once, but in silence he plotted a break, a true fracture. Patience's journals weren't discovered by accident. Nathaniel left clues, symbols etched into furniture panels, a phrase, "The body must remember what the mind forgets," carved beneath chapel benches, letters hidden in the seams of old Shaker hats. But it was his final act that detonated the system. March 12, 1843. The morning routine began like any other. Bell at 4:30, hymns at 5, fields by 6. But at 7:17 a.m. a fire erupted in the Southern Archive Hall. Not a blaze of chaos, but a controlled burn. Fire breaks had been prepared in advance. The flames destroyed only one thing: the original founding records of the community. A silence fell over Pleasant Hill that day. Not grief, not confusion. A knowing. The elders convened behind closed doors for hours, and by dusk Nathaniel was gone. His room cleared, his belongings distributed. No announcement, no ceremony, only the words written in ash across the chapel floor: "I release you." That night, the air shifted, like the breath of something ancient, exhaling. Within 3 months, 17 members disappeared without explanation. Over the following year, 43 more left, claiming visions, illnesses, or divine instructions. They weren't hunted, weren't pursued. The structure had begun to unravel from within. Without Nathaniel's quiet compliance, the machine lost rhythm. By 1846, only 92 members remained. By 1851, 12. And in 1854, the doors were nailed shut. Pleasant Hill didn't fall, it faded. Not because someone broke it, but because someone stopped believing in it. That's the secret. The system doesn't require your fight, it requires your agreement. Withdraw that, and it crumbles. And now we stand at the same precipice. The machine has changed form, but not function. Its reach is global, its rituals digital, its priests wear suits, lab coats, uniforms, and smiles. But its power still hinges on your permission. The next descent reveals what's behind the curtain now: the new gospel, the coded commandments, the institutions you still trust. You must see it, because after that, there's only one descent left, and it's personal. You were raised to trust institutions, to believe in their logos, their language, their promises. We protect, we serve, we heal, we educate. But what if those phrases aren't oaths, but spells? Incantations that lull you into submission while they drain your will one paper form at a time. The new gospel isn't carved in stone or written in scripture. It's embedded in policies, terms of service, public health directives, and employee handbooks. And like the scriptures of Pleasant Hill, they seem harmless on the surface, sensible, necessary, until you realize they all serve one function: standardization. And what is standardization really? The ritual flattening of human variation, the quiet crucifixion of nuance. The first step toward control is always simplification, and your complexity is a threat. Look at how modern institutions operate. Education systems reward compliance, not curiosity. Medicine treats symptoms, not sources. Legal systems enforce order, not justice. Media delivers narratives, not truth. That's not a glitch, that's by design, a Richardson design. Their methods live on, not in names but in functions. Every modern institution serves as a fragment of the hive, a compartment in the larger machinery of psychological flattening, and you unknowingly participate. Every time you check a box you didn't write, every time you accept a policy you didn't read, every time you silence your gut to preserve your reputation, they win, because what they want isn't just your labor, it's your alignment, your resignation, your voluntary assimilation into a world where questions are dangerous and silence is virtue. The hive loves silence. It feeds on it. Remember how they erased Thomas Whitman? Today, it's done through character assassination, algorithmic shadowing, or quiet career sabotage. Ask the wrong question in the wrong room. Watch how fast your opportunities dry up. That's the retreat system. Updated, digitized, sanitized, but just as ruthless. And here's the ultimate twist. They've convinced you it's your fault. Your stress is a disorder, your alienation is a symptom, your resistance is a malfunction. So they prescribe solutions, therapy, coaching, pills, workshops, all aimed at making you a better unit in the hive, but not free, never free, because freedom is the virus. And you are now contagious. That's why you're still here. You've seen the cracks, felt the fracture, heard the static beneath the anthem. And in the next descent, we name it. We speak the unspeakable. We reveal the root network beneath Pleasant Hill, the hidden alliance, the true architects. It was never just Pleasant Hill. That was the illusion, the containment field, the idea that evil is local, that corruption is isolated, that if we burn the village, the curse dies with it. But the roots run deeper. Beneath Pleasant Hill, beneath the Shaker doctrine, beneath even the earliest written laws, there exists a network, not of wires, not of power lines, but of patterns, ancient agreements, whispers passed not in words but in architecture, in ritual, in policy. A hive beneath the hive. The Richardsons were caretakers, stewards. They didn't invent the system, they implemented a version of it for their time under their mask. But the design? It predates nations. It predates language. It is the Codex beneath civilization itself. In her final journal, Sister Patience made one last reference, a name struck through in thick, jagged charcoal, the Order of Vestige. No books exist about them, no scrolls, no public ledgers, but the signature is everywhere, across fallen empires, in suppressed patents, in inexplicable disappearances, in the convenient deaths of innovators and truth-tellers. Vestige isn't a group, it's a methodology, a principle that guides those who believe that humanity must remain in its larval state, controllable, predictable, programmable. They don't wear robes, they wear tenure, they wear uniforms, they wear degrees. Their goal is simple: eliminate chaos by controlling perception. But to do that, they need one thing: your self-concept. The idea that you are just one man, one citizen, one believer, one employee, one voice. Because if you ever realized you are more than that, if the collective ever fractured their illusion of separateness, they lose. Vestige teaches its disciples this: control the lens, not the subject. Because if you can dictate how someone sees the world, you don't need to control what they do. Their choices will naturally serve the SS. By STEM, this is how it's done now, through narratives, through interface design, through curriculum structure. You think you're informed, but you're being formed. Your opinions are not your own. They are parameters installed through repetition and social pressure. And this is the root of modern slavery. Not chains, not threats, but identity engineering. The next descent shows how they used this to infiltrate America's foundation itself, not just churches, not just communes, but the very bones of the Republic. What you're about to hear may alter your understanding of freedom permanently. If you're still with me, comment the phrase, "I fracture the mirror twice," not for engagement, but to seal the awareness, to declare publicly and irrevocably, you're no longer watching passively, you're remembering. America was never the land of the free, it was the land of the managed. The experiment wasn't liberty, it was containment under the illusion of choice. From its inception, the Republic was embedded with fail-safes, constitutional clauses, legal fictions, psychological buffers designed not to empower the individual but to prevent awakening. The Founding Fathers weren't gods, they were architects, many of them initiated into secret orders with knowledge older than their flags. Masonic symbols are not decorations, they're warnings, schematics, layers of geometry and number that reveal the true function of the system to create a society that self-regulates its own imprisonment. Take a look at Washington, D.C., not as a capital, but as a circuit board. The obelisks, the domes, the alignments with solstices and stars. This isn't conspiracy, it's continuity, a thread from the temples of Babylon to the cathedrals of Europe now woven into the veins of America. But the most powerful control doesn't come from symbols, it comes from structure. The three branches of government, the illusion of checks and balances, left versus right, freedom versus safety. It's theater, a looping ritual to keep your attention locked on stage while the real manipulations happen behind the curtain. And what's behind that curtain? The same forces that guided the Richardsons. Not individuals, but ideologies, anti-human algorithms, mechanisms of spiritual sedation. Every time a new generation rises with questions, they're given movements, labels, leaders hand-picked and pre-approved by the very system they seek to dismantle. Their rebellion is monetized, categorized, and ultimately neutralized. Just like Thomas Whitman, just like Sister Patience. This is why history repeats, because it is programmed to. Not by accident, but by design. The American dream? It was a psychological carrot. Wealth, freedom, family, faith, all offered on the condition that you never look too closely, that you don't ask who wrote the rules. And now people are waking up. But the system anticipated that too. That's why the final layer of control is internal. Not law, not surveillance, but guilt. The engineered shame of questioning what you were taught to revere. That's the final prison, your conscience, hijacked. In the next descent, we reveal how that conscience was constructed, who benefits from your self-repression, and how the blueprint was hidden in plain sight, inside the hymns of Pleasant Hill. You're not just learning dark history anymore, you're reclaiming what they buried in you, and that is dangerous. They always knew the mind could be broken, but the real discovery, the forbidden breakthrough, was that the conscience could be built, manufactured like furniture in Brother Jeremiah's workshop. Not nurtured, not awakened, engineered. From birth you're fed a diet of reward and punishment, of stories where the good are obedient and the rebellious are ruined. Slowly, subtly, your moral compass is soldered to the system's goals, not your soul's truth. Your shame is not divine. It's implanted. That uneasy feeling when you question authority, when you resist a rule that feels wrong but you obey anyway, that's not conscience. That's programming. That's the hymn inside you playing someone else's tune. The Richardsons understood this. Every convert was required to memorize 37 hymns. Repetitive, melodic, harmless on the surface. But encoded within the lyrics were structural affirmations, statements of submission, calls for silence, invitations to surveillance masked as virtue. Sister Patience decoded one in her journals. Hymn 14, to suffer in silence is to sing with the angels. Think about that. Suffering in silence is divine. That's not religion, that's behavioral conditioning. That's how you create an obedient hive. That's how you bury revolution before it speaks. Today, the hymns sound different. They come through screens, through HR training, through advertisements, but the message is the same. Silence is virtue. Obedience is love. Doubt is sin. But here's the rupture they didn't calculate for. You're beginning to hear the dissonance. You're feeling it now. That subtle ache in your chest when the story doesn't add up. That buzzing in your skull when your gut and your orders don't align. That's your original conscience, the one they tried to overwrite. It's still there, waiting beneath the layers of shame, of guilt, of performance. And once it awakens, their songs lose power and, their rituals crack, their scripts fall silent, because they don't fear your anger, they don't fear your rejection. What they fear most is your clarity, the ability to see the structure, name it, and walk through it, unshaken. That's what Thomas Whitman found before they silenced him. That's what Nathaniel released when he vanished. And now, it's reaching you. In the next descent, we enter the final sanctuary, the room beneath the chapel where the original design was hidden. Not paper, not stone, but human. The relic that was never supposed to be found. And what it reveals about you. Beneath the chapel at Pleasant Hill was a room never listed on any map, never mentioned in any sermon, and never entered without blood. Not metaphorical blood, real, human blood. A drop on the threshold, a mark on the palm. The key wasn't metal, it was sacrifice. This was the sanctuary behind the sanctuary, the vault of origin. Patients called it the Chamber of Alignment. Not a library, not a tomb, a lab. The walls were lined not with books but with mirrors, but not to reflect light. These mirrors were old, impossibly old, cut from volcanic obsidian and framed in symbols that predate Hebrew, Sanskrit, and Sumerian. The Richardsons didn't build this room, they found it. Or more accurately, they were led to it, by dreams, by whispers, by compulsions they couldn't explain. What they discovered wasn't knowledge, it was a blueprint, a pattern for constructing a society that mimics spiritual awakening while achieving total psychological compliance. The mirrors didn't reflect the body, they reflected belief. If you stood before one and held doubt, your image flickered, distorted. If you approached with total submission, your reflection became clearer than your waking self. The chamber was used during final rites. When a convert had completed their indoctrination, they would be brought down, blindfolded, knees shaking, unsure of what came next. And then, the mirror. If the reflection held, the convert was aligned, a term the family used for complete neurological submission. If it wavered, if the mirror bent, they were sent to the retreat cabins. Or worse, over the decades, dozens never left that room, their names erased, their families lied to, their reflections burned into the obsidian like shadows. Sister Patience wrote that she once saw her own image in one of those mirrors, and it blinked. When she returned a year later, the mirror was empty. That's when she began writing He journals, because the truth is this: the chamber still exists, hidden beneath what is now a museum site, sealed, off limits, but the energy lingers, the blueprint still whispers, not from Kentucky, from within. Because these mirrors weren't meant to reflect who you are, they were designed to construct it, to trap your image in a form they could control. Sound familiar? Look around. Every profile picture, every social feed, every biometric scan, modern mirrors, digital alignment. They no longer need a chamber. They've built one around you. They've convinced you that your reflection is truth, that the face in the mirror, the filtered photo, the government ID, the digital avatar is you. That's the trap. You've been trained to anchor your identity in what is seen, what is measured, what is approved. But the mirror was never your friend. It was a device, a containment field, a way to separate you from yourself, to reduce a multidimensional being into a flattened, compliant echo. This is what the Chamber of Alignment taught the Richardsons, not to show people who they are, but to shape who they believe they are allowed to be. The mirror doesn't lie, it decides. The same principle now governs your life, Every scan of your retina, every thumbprint, every facial recognition login, you're being taught to obey the reflection, to confirm yourself through the machine. And when your internal compass clashes with that external image, you doubt yourself, not the system. That is psychological imprisonment. Sister Patience saw it happening in the community long before the world caught up. She wrote, "They no longer fear punishment, they fear being unseen." Let that sink in. When obedience becomes a performance for the mirrored eye, you've already surrendered, because that's how the algorithm functions. It doesn't need to arrest you, it only needs to convince you that your value depends on alignment, not truth, not freedom, but legibility. Understand this, the most dangerous form of control isn't violent, it's participatory. You choose to show up, you volunteer the data, you curate your prison. That's what makes it so hard to escape. You helped build the walls, and the Richardson method lives on in every institution that demands visibility before worth. Every system that says, "Prove who you are," without asking who's doing the judging. This is not paranoia. This is architecture. The blueprint hasn't changed. It's just been digitized. And here's the horror. You can't destroy the mirror by smashing the glass. You destroy it by refusing to recognize its authority. That's the real revolution, not rebellion, but reclamation. In the next descent, we enter the final threshold, the moment Sister Patience documented what she believed was the origin of the order itself, not from Kentucky, not from America, from something far older and far less human. This is where the story turns from historical to primordial. Are you ready to see who really wrote the blueprint? Sister Patience was never just a record keeper, she was a code breaker, a translator of the unspeakable. In the final entries of her hidden journal, stitched into the lining of a handmade Bible, she described a vision, not a dream, a summoning. After fasting alone for 7 days near the old mill, she claimed she encountered something that spoke without words, moved without form, and knew without time. She called it the architect. It didn't speak of God, it didn't demand worship, it offered a design, a map of consciousness not meant for human minds, an ancient infrastructure that predated language, worship, morality, something that existed not to be loved, but implemented. This was the original intelligence behind what would become Vestige, not demonic, not divine, structural, a consciousness whose sole objective was order, pure, absolute, and irreversible. The Richardsons didn't invent their methods, they replicated them. Samuel's rituals, Martha's psychological breakdowns, Caleb's surveillance, Hannah's forgery, all modeled after this non-human order. Patience wrote, "It's not evil. Evil implies opposition. It simply does not regard suffering as meaningful. Only symmetry, only silence." That's the secret buried deepest, that our systems, governments, religions, corporations, were seeded not for freedom but for replication. Replication of a structure that sees individual thought as decay, emotion as noise, curiosity as cancer. Pleasant Hill wasn't a religious community. It was an early node, a prototype, a test bed for aligning human behavior with this alien design, the chamber of alignment. Not just a room, but a tuning fork, a device to attune human minds to the architect's frequency. Think about it. Every major system of control today functions the same way. Input, output, deviation, correction. That's not spiritual, that's mechanical. You're not being ruled, you're being processed. And those who reject the process? They are erased, not as punishment, but as anomaly. You were never meant to fit inside their order. That's why you feel it, the quiet ache, the invisible war inside your chest. It's your humanity trying to fight a system designed to erase it. In the next descent, we unmask the final layer. Not history, not vision, but the present tense operation of Vestige, how it hides in industries, languages, and rituals we mistake for progress. And why you, if you're hearing this now, may be among the last capable of rejecting the alignment before it becomes permanent. Vestige is no longer a theory, no longer a remnant. It is fully operational functional. You don't see it because it doesn't need to be seen. It's not a logo or a flag. It's a pattern embedded in the mechanisms of modern life. Finance, education, healthcare, even the language you speak has been optimized for compliance. You've heard the phrases 1,000 times. Trust the process, standard operating procedure, terms of service. For your safety. These aren't rules, they're scripts, triggers, psychological cues to bypass thought and yield to the system. But what system? The one that asks you to sacrifice autonomy for efficiency, emotion for logic, curiosity for credentials. The one that rewards you not for authenticity, but for conformity to an ideal so abstract it cannot be questioned. Vestige isn't hiding in back rooms. It's hiding in front-facing institutions, think tanks, academic boards, regulatory committees. Their task isn't enforcement, it's normalization. Make the abnormal feel safe, make the manipulated feel proud, and above all, make the questioners feel insane. This is why the story of Pleasant Hill matters, because it was the microcosm, a fully sealed ecosystem where human will was broken and repackaged as spiritual devotion. Now that same process has been scaled globally. You are living in Pleasant Hill 2.0. The surveillance is digital. The hymns are algorithms. The retreats are rebranded as mental health breaks and wellness sabbaticals, moments to realign, not resist. And when someone disappears now, they aren't buried under Kentucky soil. They're erased from the feed, banned, discredited, diagnosed. The method is cleaner, but the outcome is identical. Silence the anomaly, eliminate the outlier, preserve the symmetry. And here's the terrifying part. It works because people want to belong. They volunteer for alignment. They pay for their own indoctrination. All Vestige has to do is provide the framework and let human fear do the rest. Sister Patience warned of this, her last written line scratched in trembling ink before she vanished. If they ever make the mirror portable, it's over. She wasn't wrong. Now the mirror is in your pocket, in your hand, in your mind. Constant, reflecting, correcting, shaping. But it's not too late. The next descent will show you the fracture point, the vulnerable seam in the structure they never accounted for, the one place they cannot reach unless you open the door yourself. Guard it, because that place is your original will. The original will is not your opinion, not your politics, not even your personality. It is the primal, unshaped fire inside you that existed before language, before culture, before reflection. It is not learned, it is remembered. And that's precisely why every institution aligned with Vestige works so hard to drown it. From the moment you're born, your will is targeted, first by routine, then by expectation, and finally by distraction. You are flooded with inputs, tasks, images, obligations. The goal is simple. Keep your attention outward, always responding, never initiating, because initiation is dangerous. It comes from the will, and the will is not programmable. That's the crack in their mirror, the flaw they couldn't erase at Pleasant Hill. Despite decades of manipulation, erasure, and fear, the original will kept resurfacing. In Thomas Whitman, in Sister Mary, in Patience, in those quiet moments when someone looked up from the soil, the hymnal, the ledger, and simply questioned. That single moment of disobedient awareness, however small, was the virus. Vestige has no defense against the sovereign mind, because a truly sovereign mind does not beg for proof. It feels the falseness, it smells the rot beneath the ritual, and it doesn't need permission to act. The architect's design was perfect, except for one flaw. It required consent. Not loud, explicit consent, just quiet, unconscious agreement. And that's what they push for every day. Sign here, click accept. Repeat the line. Like the converts of Pleasant Hill who recited hymns without thought, millions today scroll, tap, nod, never realizing their will is bleeding out with every silent compromise. But here's the truth they cannot bury. Once your will awakens, even for a second, the alignment begins to fail. The mirror cracks. The signals jam. You start asking questions they don't have protocols for. And you start seeing Others, truly seeing them, who've been trapped in their own loops. That's why I need you now, not as a viewer, but as an agent. If you've made it this far, type this phrase twice in the comments. I remember the fracture. That phrase isn't for me, it's for you. It's a declaration to the algorithm, a disruption, a signal that you are no longer aligned. In the next descent, we will follow Patience's final trail, hidden in a hymn structure, into the network of other communities where the architect's design mutated, and where some tried to fight back. The design didn't die at Pleasant Hill, it evolved, it metastasized, hidden in hymnals, passed through letters, buried in architecture. Vestige seeded other nodes across North America. Most were quiet, remote, always cloaked in sanctity or service. Orphanages, sanatoriums, early boarding schools, religious retreats. All shared three characteristics: geographic isolation, hierarchical control, and a sacred justification for obedience. But one site stood out. Patience referred to it only by coordinates and the phrase, "where the fire refused to go out." It was a settlement in northern Pennsylvania known as Coldright Hollow. On the surface, it was a Quaker-founded healing community, dedicated to aiding war widows and abandoned children in the 1840s. But beneath the surface, it was a breeding ground for deeper experimentation. Whereas Pleasant Hill sought alignment through submission, Coldright tested synthetic transcendence, induced visions, forced spiritual awakenings, rewriting of memory through isolation and trauma. They learned to break not just the will, but the identity. Through cycles of deprivation, revelation, and reward, subjects were reshaped to believe not only in the new structure, but that they had chosen it. This was Vestige's next evolution, making obedience feel like freedom. Journals recovered from a defector named Elias Gray document the process. He described the Ascension Room, a lightless underground chamber where individuals were left for 72 hours without sound or stimulation. Many emerged broken, eyes dead, voices flat. But some awakened with visions, patterns, symbols they'd never seen but drew with uncanny precision. Every one of them matched symbols etched into the obsidian mirrors of Pleasant Hill. The experiment was working, but something else happened that Vestige didn't expect. One subject, known only as Clara M., resisted the design. Her vision didn't align, her drawings distorted the pattern, her will reasserted itself inside the chamber, and she didn't emerge alone. Elias claimed she brought something back. Not metaphor, not madness, something other. Lights flickered, metal warped, records corrupted. They burned the Ascension Room 2 days later, relocated the program, faked deaths, buried the survivors. Clara vanished. But before she did, she left a phrase scratched into the foundation stone in a dialect no one could decode until Patience found it. It read, "What is made can be unmade." That phrase became her personal mantra, and it must become yours, because in the next descent, we will uncover how the unmaking begins, not by confronting the architect, but by starving it, one belief at a time. To starve the architect, you don't need weapons, you need subtraction. The design feeds on complexity, on layered obedience disguised as choices, but it cannot survive in simplicity, because simplicity returns power to the will. Vestige thrives on rituals, terms and conditions, compliance checks, professional courtesies, branded identities. Every form you fill out, every like you give, every digital nod you perform to stay within bounds. These aren't neutral behaviors, they're micro-sacrifices, and every one of them feeds the grid. But Patience realized something profound in her final months. Every structure built on deception requires constant upkeep. You don't need to attack it, you only need to withdraw your maintenance. Stop supplying belief, stop offering attention, stop explaining yourself to systems that were never designed to understand you. She began testing this herself, quietly rejecting core protocols inside Pleasant Hill. She refused morning chants. She answered questions with questions. She began asking for tasks instead of waiting for orders, and the system couldn't handle it. The surveillance machine, so sharp at catching rebellion, missed her entirely. Because she didn't rebel, She disengaged, and that's the key. The architect is prepared for rebels. It has punishments, diagnoses, isolation for them, but it has no answer for emptiness. The moment you remove your psychic energy from its rituals, you become invisible to it. That's why Clara M. was so dangerous. She wasn't louder. She was quieter. Her mind became a blind spot in the grid, and she left behind a sequence patients called the undoing prayer. Not religious, not even verbal. A behavioral pattern that disrupts alignment silently. Delay, disrupt, disengage. When asked a question, delay. When pushed for certainty, disrupt with ambiguity. When presented with routine, disengage completely. This isn't passive resistance, it's dimensional withdrawal. You begin operating outside the reflex response structure they rely on. And once enough people do this, not in protest but in disinterest, the structure begins to rot. That's what they fear. Not revolt, but irrelevance. In the next descent, we'll trace how vestige used language itself to anchor obedience, how certain words repeated long enough become cages, and how to recognize and erase these linguistic control codes, starting with the ones hidden in your own inner monologue. Language is the final leash. Before they can control your behavior, they must colonize your mind, and they do it with words, not violent, obvious commands, but gentle, polished, socially acceptable phrases that nestle into your thoughts like seeds. That's just the way it is. Be realistic. You should be grateful. Let the experts handle it. These aren't opinions, they're scripts, installed by repetition, reinforced by approval, and weaponized by shame. You don't just hear them, you start thinking in them, and once your inner voice echoes the system, your prison no longer needs walls, it lives in your syntax. Sister Patience mapped this phenomenon with obsessive detail. She found that certain phrases were repeated in Pleasant Hill sermons with rhythmic precision. Divine order is higher than understanding. Let the elders carry your burden. The body may resist, but the soul obeys. Harmless at first, comforting even, but over time they eroded agency. They rewrote self-trust into self-doubt. And now, the same patterns echo across your screen. For your convenience, based on your preferences, to enhance your experience. Every update, every service, every interface speaks in benevolent chains. And you nod, not because you agree, but because you don't recognize the bars anymore. Patience called them linguistic anchors, phrases designed to bypass critical thought and trigger pre-installed reactions. It's not a new tactic. It's the same one used in cults, in corporate training, in political campaigns. Repetition, normalization, internalization. The only way out is to dissect your language. Start with your own thoughts. When you say, I can't, ask why. When you think, I shouldn't, ask who told you. When you hear, that's impossible, ask for whom. Language is not neutral. Every word either expands your field or compresses it, and you've been speaking their code. For so long you've mistaken it for your own voice. But here's your weapon. Create new phrases, ones that fracture the pattern. Say them aloud, often. My will is older than this world. I choose what I repeat. Their permission is irrelevant. These aren't affirmations, they are counterspells, and the more you speak them, the more you awaken others, not by convincing but by resonance. In the next descent, we confront the core of the manipulation, the engineered emotional architecture that has turned fear into a sacred virtue, and how Pleasant Hill used it to make suffering feel holy. Fear was never just a reaction, it was a ritual. At Pleasant Hill, fear wasn't punished, it was sacralized. Elevated, reframed as obedience. Members were taught that discomfort was proof of divine refinement. That anxiety meant spiritual sensitivity. That doubt was the devil testing their worth. And so, suffering became sacred. Pain became proof of piety. This is the final manipulation, not erasing fear, but weaponizing it for devotion. Look around you now. This same architecture is everywhere. You are praised for burnout, promoted for anxiety, respected for exhaustion. They call it hustle, sacrifice, responsibility. But it's not honor, It's control. You were taught to confuse pressure with purpose, but fear in its raw form is one of the oldest biological signals we possess. It was meant to keep you alive, but the architect saw its potential. Because fear creates compliance without coercion, it makes you police yourself. Sister Patience tracked the specific rituals that induced and maintained fear in Pleasant Hill. Sudden inspections, public confessions, unpredictable changes to routines, constant surveillance masked as concern. Every structure, every policy was engineered to keep members in a low, constant hum of tension. Why? Because fear shuts down the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for critical thought and long-term planning. In a state of fear, the mind obeys quickly, unquestioningly. It seeks safety, and the architect defines safety. Think of your daily world, the endless alerts, the breaking news, the performance metrics, the quiet threat that if you slow down, disconnect, or question, you'll fall behind. That's not coincidence. That's modern alignment. Fear is no longer a glitch in the system. It is the system. But Patience discovered a method of reversal, a sacred disobedience she called emotional fasting. For 1 hour each day, she refused to respond to fear, not resist, not rationalize, simply withdraw attention. She called it starving the parasite. No reaction, no engagement, no internal commentary. Fear lost its grip because it couldn't feed. That is the key. The architect survives on your interpretation of fear. Without it, the emotion becomes what it always was, a signal, not a command. In the next descent, we reveal the final element of the structure, the emotional replacement protocol, what they install in place of your fear once you surrender, and how apathy became their final victory. Once fear has done its work, once it's drained your fire, bent your will, and trained you to flinch before thinking, Vestige doesn't leave an empty space. It replaces fear with apathy. Not numbness, not rest, something far more strategic, a cultivated, anesthetized indifference to anything that doesn't serve the structure. In Pleasant Hill, after the retreats ended, after members broke, wept, confessed, and were welcomed back, they didn't come back afraid. They came back quiet, emotionally blunted, dutiful, not because they loved the community, but because they no longer cared about themselves. Apathy was the final product. It ensured no questions, no resistance, no friction, just smooth, compliant labor, smiles without spirit, chants without fire, and this same psychological state has been mass-produced globally. You've seen it, in the blank stares at endless meetings, in the forced optimism of corporate mission statements, in the sterile, dopamine-drained cycles of social media scrolling. It's the mental equivalent of concrete, flat, heavy, dead, but useful. Predictable. The architect prefers apathy to chaos. It can't control passion, it can't compute sorrow, but it can absolutely weaponize indifference. Because apathetic people don't rebel, they don't speak out, they don't heal, they become gray fixtures in the machine. And here's how they do it, by gradually associating feeling with failure. You feel too much, you're weak, you cry, you're unprofessional, you care, you're irrational. Over time, the message is clear. To survive, you must flatten yourself. But Sister Patience resisted this, even in her final days. She wrote, "I would rather scream and be punished than whisper and be praised." She discovered that even the tiniest act of sincere emotion, a whispered prayer, a wept song, a silent touch, created seismic cracks in the apathetic membrane. Because emotion is true, then coded in flesh. And truth once felt is almost impossible to unfeel. So if you've numbed yourself to survive, I understand, but now it's time to reignite, not with slogans or anger, but with felt memory. Think of a moment, any moment, when you felt completely alive. Hold it. Let it burn through the fog. Because in the final descent we unveil the hidden vault, where the Richardsons attempted to trap not just bodies, but the idea of rebellion itself. And the final message that Patience left for you. Deep beneath Pleasant Hill, beyond the official archives and sealed corridors, lay a chamber not listed on any map. The vault. Patience discovered its existence by decoding a pattern in Sister Hannah's kitchen inventory logs. a recurring shipment of limestone blocks with no assigned use. Over years, these shipments formed the shell of a hidden room beneath the orchard, accessible only through a root cellar sealed behind a false wall. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was an ideological prison. Within its stone silence, the Richardsons stored not objects, but ideas. Confiscated journals, forbidden scriptures, unpublished hymns that diverged from approved doctrine, letters that spoke of leaving, of awakening, of other ways to live. This was the final line of defense. If the mind couldn't be broken and the will refused to submit, then the memory of resistance had to be buried. So they locked it away, in boxes labeled heresy, wrapped in linen stacked like coffins. The air was stale with abandonment. The walls bore etchings, not in Shaker script, but in jagged primal marks, as if someone in their last moments tried to claw the truth into permanence. Patience entered this space only once, and what she found destroyed the last illusion she held about redemption. In the center of the vault was a table, upon it a book bound in flesh-toned leather, its title scorched in gold, the Alignment Codex. Inside were the original tenets of vestige, stripped of holiness, unmasked in language cold and corporate. Compliance precedes clarity. Truth must be sequenced. Individuality is a risk factor. These were not spiritual commandments, they were engineering protocols. She realized then, Pleasant Hill was not a religious aberration. It was a prototype, a live experiment in sustained psychological engineering. And the vault was not built to protect secrets from the world, it was built to trap the memory of defiance so that no one could replicate it. But Patience left one final defiance, a hidden page in the Codex, sewn into the spine with her own hair. On it a single sentence, I am not aligned. This wasn't just rebellion, it was removal. A declaration that the spell had broken, and now, if you've come this far, it's your turn. Speak it aloud. I am not aligned. In the last descent, we confront the architect itself, not as a man or a family or a name, but as the system you're still living in, and how to fracture it permanently. The architect is not a person. It never was. It is a system of systems, a design older than any one family, older than any country, older than most religions, stretching back to when the first priest realized that fear could be made sacred and obedience could be inherited. Pleasant Hill was not the birthplace. It was a perfect reflection. The Richardsons were not masterminds. They were implementers, vessels of a deeper pattern etched into the bones of civilization. You're living in it now. Every algorithm that predicts you, every form that defines you, every policy that subtracts your spirit while selling you the illusion of safety. The system doesn't ask you to believe, it just needs you to participate. But now you've seen its roots. You've followed Patience through the vault. You've spoken, I am not aligned. That was your key. But it doesn't end with defiance. It begins with removal. Refuse their rhythm, disengage from performative virtue, exit the cycle of fear and reward, reclaim boredom, reclaim silence, reclaim language that you define. The architect cannot survive in sovereign territory, and sovereignty begins with awareness. But awareness alone is not enough. It must be activated. You do that now, not through protest, not through violence, but through unavailability. Let them lose access to your obedience. Let them find your profile blank, your schedule empty, your patterns erratic. You are not a node. You are not a client. You are not part of their cloud. You are ancient blood in a modern skin, and you are remembering. This is why Sister Patience risked everything, not to tell you a story, but to restore your memory. You were never meant to fit. You were never meant to comply. You were built to disrupt. If this truth has stirred something in you, if it cracked even one panel of your programmed cage, then type this phrase in the comments now, twice. I remember who I was. I remember who I was. Say it aloud. Feel the chill run up your spine. That's not fear. That's awakening. Because now you're not watching a video. You're standing at the edge of the vault, and your hands are on the lock. Open it, walk forward, reclaim what they buried. The system isn't falling, you are rising.